Okay, so you guys have looked at questionnaires and you've looked at interviews. Research methods 4. Today we're talking about experiments. Now this is going to sound quite similar to your GCSE science lessons, so hopefully some of this will feel a bit more familiar. Now hopefully you already know what experiments are, but just in case you don't, here's how I'd like you to kind of phrase it. Experiments are a research method that are aiming to prove a cause and effect relationship. Okay, that's an important concept that we're going to be talking about a bit more in the future. So they're trying to prove that one thing causes a change in another thing. X causes Y. They're used a lot in the natural sciences, your biology, chemistry, physics, and some sociologists want sociology to be scientific like those sciences, and so want to use experiments and find value in them. As with the other research methods, we need to know the different types and we need to know the strengths and weaknesses of these types. With experiments, there's two main types. One is a laboratory experiment or a lab experiment, so done in a completely controlled environment. Every single possible variable is highly controlled. Usually this takes place in kind of universities and spaces like that. And so that's what we're talking about with a lab experiment. Field experiments are done in the real world, done in the field. So they're still trying to control all the variables, but it's much harder to do that in the real world because you can't control absolutely everything. You can't control necessarily the temperature and sound and all the different extraneous variables that might be taking place. So those are your main two types. On the note sheet, you need to get a definition for those two, please. So when you're conducting an experiment or thinking about conducting an experiment, there's this kind of process that you'd go through. This is a very slimmed down and basic version of that. Essentially, you start with a hypothesis, a prediction of something that will happen, a prediction of that cause and effect relationship. So for example, we could say that when a teacher labels a student, it will affect their achievement. It will affect how well they do. And within that hypothesis, there's generally an independent variable and a dependent variable. So what we've got with the independent variable, the IV, is it's the actual thing that the research is going to manipulate, the thing that the research is going to change. So in this case, in this example, whether or not a student gets a label, whether or not the teacher labels the student as smart, is our independent variable. That's the thing that's being manipulated. So there's two groups there, the labeled group and the non-labeled group. The dependent variable is the factor that's being measured to see if it's been affected by the IV. So the DV needs to see whether it's been affected by the IV. In this example, what we've got is the test scores a year later, based on whether or not they were labeled, would tell us whether there's a relationship between those two. So that's the thing we're measuring, not the thing we're changing. So could you get, again, a definition for those three kind of key elements of an experiment? Oh, there are more elements to it. You're talking about controlling all the extraneous variables, and there's control groups and things like that. I just want the very basics of it right now. These are the three things I definitely want you to be aware of. So get those things noted into the sheet, please. Okay, it's time to start thinking about the perverts, the strengths and weaknesses. On your note sheet, you'll find a much simpler version of the table that I've got on the slides. Now, you might want to think about how you're going to record this information in the kind of clearest way, because sometimes there's strengths or weaknesses of just the one type of experiment, the lab or the field experiment, and sometimes the strengths and weaknesses of both. So you may want to add a couple of columns to your table, or you may want to color code the information into kind of strengths and weaknesses, field and lab, or both. Needs some thinking. It needs to be nice and clear, because when you come to revise from this stuff, I don't want it to be confusing, but I want you to find what's going to work best for you. So before you even start writing anything, think about how you're best going to record this information in a nice, clear, accessible way. I do think some kind of columns and I do think some kind of colors are going to help you there. So try and get that sorted. You can pause the video obviously to think about that, make some notes and come back to it. I'll start talking about the practical strengths first. So whether it's field or lab, practically they're a bit weak. Okay, they take a long time to set up because remember you're trying to control every single aspect of the environment. You're trying to control all the extraneous variables to make sure it's only your IV and DV that are having an impact. So that can be quite costly and time consuming, might need a number of different resources. It obviously depends on the type of experiment and what you're studying, but that generally is considered to be impractical, both for a lab and for a field. In terms of ethics and kind of how morally right these can be done, again, it will vary depending on what type of experiment it is, whether it's a lab experiment or a field experiment. A lab experiment can be done completely ethically. You can have informed consent, you can have no deception, you can protect your participants from harm, you can keep it all confidential and anonymous. The problem with that is that you will end up with something called the Hawthorne effect, which I'll talk about later when we talk about validity. But what that means is sometimes there will be deception because otherwise you don't get very valid results. So sometimes you might have to lie to the participants about what the study is about, what the experiment is about. Because obviously in a lab experiment, they're being invited to come to a university or somewhere like that. So they know that they're being studied. They know that something's going on. Generally, their behavior won't be a true reflection of their real life. So sometimes you might have to lie to them about what the study is focusing on so that you actually get more valid results. Now, in a field experiment, you can kind of do it two ways. You can do it overtly or covertly. You'll need to know what these two words mean. Covertly means that you're doing it kind of undercover, that they don't know you're actually experimenting on them. That obviously, if you're in the real world and you're doing it covertly, you are lacking informed consent. That has a level of unethical factors in it. As well as, the same thing, you might be deceiving people, you might be lying to people, but that might be the only way you can do the research. Now, if it's done overtly, so you go in and you tell people, in a school or in town, wherever you are in the real world, you're telling them that you're doing an experiment, then obviously, ethically speaking, you're fine. The problem, again, is it affects the validity. So make sure you get some notes about that stuff, and we'll go into the validity and we'll kind of connect some of those ideas together as we do. In fact, while we're talking about it, when you're writing exam answers, you often find that these strengths and weaknesses kind of pair up, and you'll be writing about one strength that links to another weakness, and they kind of work together sometimes or work against each other, and that's really good practice. So when you see a link between a strength and a weakness for a particular method, it's always good to be aware of that, make a note of that, highlight that. Okay, let's move on. Okay, again, I know that there's a lot of information here. It looks a bit confusing. You want to think really carefully about how you record this information on your note sheet to make it work and make it clear for when you come to revise. We're going to look at reliability and validity now. Reliability, we're talking about how easy it is to replicate so that someone else can do the exact same thing that you've done in your experiment, and then we can test whether the results are the same. Now, with a lab experiment, the fact that you're in this such highly controlled environment, a completely artificial environment, it's not a real life situation, it's a completely kind of fake, controlled situation and environment. What that does mean, though, is that people can do the exact same thing. They can control everything that you controlled and do it in the exact same way. Now, that might obviously take a bit of time and a bit of effort and possibly a bit of money. So practically speaking, it's an issue. But in terms of reliability, that means you have got relatively high reliability. It can be easily replicated in the exact same way because it's all methodically thought out. It's all written down. You need to make sure the room's like this and there's this number of people and it happens at this time, and it can be done in the exact same way. The field experiment, on the other hand, is very difficult because you're in a real world setting, because you can't guarantee that you've controlled everything. It's very difficult to say this is done in the exact same way. So the reliability of a field experiment is going to be lower than that of a lab experiment. So there's an issue there that you might find that something's happening when you do your field experiment that you have no control over, and when someone tries to replicate it, something very different is happening that again they have no control over because it's done in the real world. Now, when we look at them in general, when we look at them both together, overall you would say that the reliability is higher than other methods, like for example unstructured interviews. Unstructured interviews are done very informally, change each time. Field experiments, lab experiments, generally higher in reliability, but certainly the lab experiment is more reliable than the field experiment. Okay, it's probably worth pausing the video here and getting that written down as clearly as you can. Okay, let's move on to validity. So we're talking about how accurate the information is, how truthful, how full and accurate a picture of the real world we get. There's some issues here with lab experiments, there's some weaknesses. I mentioned already something called the Hawthorne effect. This was a bit of research that basically found that when people know they're being watched, kind of know they're being researched, they change their behavior. So something about the fact that they know they're being watched that means they don't behave in the natural way. Just like you wouldn't behave the same when you know your teacher's watching compared to when you know they're not. So what we've got then is in a lab experiment, all the participants know they're being watched. There's no way of doing a lab experiment without that, because the participants have to come to this artificial environment. They have to be invited to this artificial environment. So they know that they're being researched. They might not know why they're being researched or what for, what the focus is, but they know they're being watched, and so they're not likely to behave in a normal, natural way. And that means it's low in validity. The other thing about a lab experiment that means it's low in validity is it's not a real world setting. Whenever you go to a place that you've never been to before, in an environment that you've never been to before, and you don't know what to expect, you don't behave in a natural way because you're wondering what the right way to behave is. So whenever we invite participants into an experiment, in a lab experiment, they've never, chances are they've never done it before, they don't know what to expect, so they're looking around trying to work out how to behave. It means the fact that it's an artificial setting means that they don't know how to behave normally, and therefore they won't behave normally, which means it's not like real life, it's not a true and accurate reflection, it's low in validity. Now, if we take the field experiment, what we've got is a strength. Generally, it's more valid than the lab experiment. If it's done covertly, if it's done undercover, so the participants don't know that they're being watched, which is possible in a field experiment. You could go into a school and do an experiment on students and they don't know they're being experimented on. Obviously, there's ethical issues with that, but the fact that there's no Hawthorne effect means they're more likely to behave in naturally, and that means it's higher in validity. Again, you flip the weakness of the lab experiment around. The field experiment's done in the real world. When people go to work, when they go to school, when they go into town, they know how to behave and will behave naturally and normally. So they just kind of get on with it. And that means that it is a real reflection of society. So that makes it more valid. The big problem that you get with field experiments that you don't get with lab experiments is that you can't guarantee that every extraneous variable has been controlled. Now remember, the whole point of an experiment is to prove that the IV, the independent variable, caused a change in the DV, the dependent variable. With a field experiment, you can never know for sure if it's your IV that's caused the change or whether there's some other factor, because you can't control all the factors. With a lab experiment, you can do that, and it's not actually on the slide there, but you can put that in. Lab experiment as a strength, a validity strength, is the idea that you can be sure that the IV has caused the change in the DV. You can prove the IV has caused the change in the DV. You can't do that with the field experiment. That's really important information there, that they kind of play against each other, lab experiment versus field experiment. On the whole though, if you're going to compare it to other methods, again like unstructured interviews, they're generally lower in validity. You can measure what's happening, what the change is. You can't ever find out why, because when you're doing an experiment, you're not getting into the participants' kind of thought process and the reasons why their behavior has changed. You just know that their behavior has changed. So it's very difficult to get the full valid picture with an experiment. Okay, hopefully you can make some sense of that and put that in a clear way into your note sheet. So now we'll look at some examples of experiments, one lab and one field experiment. If you do psychology, you will come across the Milgram study. It's a really interesting study, quite infamous. And with sociology, we've got the Rosenthal and Jacobson study. We'll look at that when we get into education. With the lab experiment, what Milgram did is he was trying to find out about obedience, essentially, but he lied and told the participants it was all about memory and punishment. And the whole point of that lie, it was definitely unethical, but it was the only way to actually get valid results. So it was really important that he did that deception, because otherwise the participants would have known exactly what was going on and would have changed their behavior. He actually found, it's really quite interesting, he found that people, ordinary people, would administer severe electric shocks because they thought it was part of a memory test. So they were or thought they were giving, obviously it wasn't real, but thought they were giving people lethal electric shocks. Now, if they'd known that the test was all about obedience, was all about doing what the kind of scientist was telling them to do by giving electric shocks, they wouldn't have done it. But the fact that they thought it was about memory and didn't know that the study was about obedience actually raises the validity. Obviously, the trade-off is a lot of ethical issues with Milgram, but the validity in that one was reasonably high. Now, with the field experiment, and that actually reminds me, I actually met my wife in a field. I was out for a walk one day in a field, and I met her, and I saw her, and I said to her, I was just showing this flower how beautiful you are. And she turned to me and she said, if you were a flower, I'd pick you. So that's a nice little story of how I met my wife. Anyway, Rosenthal and Jacobson, they did an experiment, field experiment in a school, and they basically went into a class and told the teacher, not the students, they told the teacher, these students over here, these ones are intelligent. Over the next year, they're going to make loads of progress, they're going to do really well. And then there were the other students who weren't labeled as super intelligent. Now, in actual fact, those students had just been randomly picked. They weren't, there was no real evidence to say they were super intelligent or not. But when they went back a year later, they'd found that the teacher's behavior towards those students who had been labeled had changed and had actually created this self-fulfilling prophecy. He actually created better results, because the teacher had treated them like they were smart, and therefore they had made more progress than the ones who weren't labeled. So it was done in the real world, it was a real life situation. The validity of that is increased because it's actually how, not an artificial setting, it's a real world setting. So you can use Rosenthal and Jacobson to back that up. Again, both of them have some ethical issues, but you can kind of justify the ethical issues in order to kind of get the validity of the study. So hopefully that makes sense. Again, you can put that down in your example section of the notes, and we'll move on to the last little bit. So we're going to finish with the issues of representativeness and the theoretical approach of the groups of sociologists who would like these methods. In terms of being representative, what we've got with a lab and a field experiment is generally, not always, but generally, it involves small samples. Because of the nature of them, because of the kind of the highly controlled nature of them, you can't really do it with loads and loads of people. So they tend to involve smaller samples. Usually lab experiments will probably have smaller samples than field experiments, but it can vary. But on the whole, compared to something like a questionnaire or a structured interview, we're talking about small samples, and therefore they tend to lack representativeness. When we're talking about the positivists and the interpretivists and who's going to prefer experiments as a theoretical thing, I already told you that certain sociologists want to be quite scientific. They want to be like biology, chemistry, physics, and those are the positivists. The positivists are all about this kind of proving cause and effect, and so they really value experiments. Interpretivists, though, don't think it's possible to prove cause and effect. You can't prove cause and effect when you're studying people in the same way that you can when you're studying things like rocks or stars or atoms. Because people think, people have consciousness, they have free will, they change how they react to a cause. So they don't see it as very valuable at all. And they also say you can't see meaning, you don't get to understand what the actual participant thinks or feels, you don't get to understand what's in their head with an experiment. You don't get to learn why, you just get to learn what. Positivists, though, very happy with it. It's objective, it produces quantitative data, so it fits with the positivist view of what sociology should be and how sociological research methods should be done. Okay, that is everything to do with experiments. It's a little bit more complicated, some of that, than perhaps we've looked at, but hopefully you managed to follow it along. If you didn't, go back, watch it again, and try again. Do the quiz now, do the questions, see how you do, and then do the review if you felt like you were struggling a bit, or go and look at one particular bit that you found more difficult than others. Okay, make sure you bring your note sheets to the lesson, and I'll see you next time.